As a doctor, I've always prided myself on my rational mind and steady nerves. For years, I worked the night shift at Central Hospital, finding comfort in the routine and the quiet hours of darkness. But what happened that autumn night 3 years ago shattered my sense of reality and left me questioning everything I thought I knew. Even now, as I write this, I can feel the chill of that encounter creeping up my spine. It was a Tuesday night, or rather, Wednesday morning. I had just finished my shift at the hospital, the clock ticking past 2 a.m. as I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped into the cool night air. The first thing I noticed was the silence, an unnatural hush that seemed to blanket the entire city. As I walked down the familiar path towards my apartment, an unusually thick fog began to roll in. It crept along the ground, swirling around my feet and climbing up the street lamps, dimming their light to a sickly yellow glow. The world around me seemed to shrink, the fog swallowing up buildings and cars, leaving only vague, looming shapes in the gloom. I quickened my pace, an inexplicable unease settling in my gut. The fog continued to thicken, and soon I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The streetlights, usually my guideposts on these late-night walks, now appeared as nothing more than faint, floating orbs in the mist. As I turned a corner, I realized with a start that I couldn't quite place where I was. The fog had transformed the familiar streets into an alien landscape. Landmarks I'd passed 100 times before were now indistinct shadows, their edges blurred and distorted. That's when I heard it, a sound so faint I wasn't sure if it was real or just my imagination playing tricks on me. A whisper, carried on the damp air, seemed to brush past my ear. I spun around, heart racing, but saw nothing but the impenetrable wall of fog. Shaking my head, I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, or perhaps my tired mind conjuring up noises in the silence. But as I turned back to continue my walk, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. I had only taken a few more steps when I sensed it, a presence behind me. The fog seemed to part, and there, emerging from the mist like a nightmare-given form, was a figure, tall and shrouded in a dark hooded cloak. It stood perfectly still, its face hidden in shadow. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, frozen in place. The figure made no move, no sound, but I could feel its gaze upon me, boring into my soul. A chill ran through my body, and for a moment I wondered if I was hallucinating from exhaustion. But then it moved. One step, then another. Slow, deliberate steps in my direction. Panic surged through me, breaking my paralysis. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the wet pavement. The fog swirled around me, obscuring my vision, but I didn't dare look back. I could hear footsteps behind me, matching my pace, always the same distance away no matter how fast I ran. My lungs burned as I gasped for air, the damp fog seeming to clog my throat. I turned down one street, then another, hoping to lose my pursuer in the maze of the city. But with each turn, with each moment I thought I might have escaped, I'd catch a glimpse of that dark figure, always there, always watching. The rational part of my mind screamed that this couldn't be happening, that there had to be a logical explanation. But as I ran through the fog-shrouded streets, logic seemed as distant and unreachable as the hidden stars above. My heart pounded in my ears as I raced through the fog-laden streets. The city I once knew had transformed into a nightmarish labyrinth, with every turn leading me deeper into unfamiliar territory. The sodden air clung to my skin, my scrubs now damp with sweat and mist. I chanced a glance over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. The hooded figure was there, closer now, its featureless face a void that seemed to draw in the surrounding fog. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning with the effort. Left, right, straight ahead. I ran without direction, hoping to lose my pursuer in the maze of alleys and side streets. But no matter how many turns I took or how fast I ran, the footsteps behind me never faltered, never grew distant. At one point, I found myself in what I thought was a dead-end alley. Panic clawed at my throat as I spun around, expecting to come face to face with my stalker. But the alley was empty, the fog swirling gently where the figure should have been. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope. Had I finally lost it? I leaned against the cold brick wall, gulping in air, my chest heaving. That's when I heard it again. That whisper, so close it could have been inside my own head. I looked up, and there it was, standing at the entrance of the alley, blocking my only escape. How had it gotten there? It was impossible, defying all logic and reason. Yet there it stood, motionless, watching. With a strangled cry, I pushed off the wall and ran again. Somehow, I found my way back to the main street, the fog parting just enough to reveal familiar landmarks. I was close to home now, so close to safety. But as I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't escaping at all. Instead, it felt as if I was being herded, guided by an unseen hand towards an unknown destination. I nearly wept with relief when I saw my apartment building looming out of the fog. With trembling hands, I fumbled for my keys, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The street behind me was empty, but I could feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows. Once inside, I slammed the door shut, engaging every lock. I didn't stop there. I moved through my apartment like a man possessed, closing curtains, checking windows, even wedging chairs under doorknobs. Only when every possible entry was secured did I allow myself to collapse on the couch, my body shaking uncontrollably. The silence in the apartment was deafening after the chaos of the chase. I strained my ears, listening for footsteps in the hallway, for that haunting whisper. But there was nothing. As the adrenaline began to ebb, exhaustion washed over me. But even as my eyelids grew heavy, I fought against sleep. What if it was waiting for me to let my guard down? What if closing my eyes meant opening the door to something I couldn't explain or escape? I sat there, every muscle tense, watching the fog press against my windows like a living thing, waiting for dawn to break. As the first weak rays of sunlight began to filter through my curtains, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. I had forgotten it was there, silent throughout my terrifying ordeal. With shaking hands, I pulled it out, half expecting to see missed calls from the hospital. Instead, there was a single text message. My blood ran cold as I saw the sender. It was my own number. With a sense of mounting dread, I opened the message. The words on the screen made my heart stop. "You can't escape yourself." I stared at the phone, my mind reeling. How was this possible? Was I losing my grip on reality? I checked and rechecked the number, but there was no mistake. The message had come from my own phone, as impossible as that seemed. In that moment, the terror of the night came rushing back, intensified by this inexplicable turn of events. Sleep was out of the question. I paced my apartment, jumping at every creak and shadow. The fog outside had thinned, but my paranoia hadn't. I kept replaying the night's events in my mind, trying to make sense of what had happened. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the hooded figure. Every time silence fell, I heard that haunting whisper. The rational part of my brain fought against the fear, insisting there had to be a logical explanation. But the message on my phone defied all logic. As dawn fully broke, I realized I had never felt so exhausted, yet so terrifyingly awake. As soon as the clock struck a reasonable hour, I called the hospital. My voice trembled as I spoke to Dr. Ramirez, the head of my department. "I'm not feeling well," I lied, though perhaps it wasn't entirely untrue. "I need to change my shift permanently. No more nights." There was a pause on the other end. Yeah. Ramirez had known me for years, knew my dedication to the night shift. "Are you sure, John? Is everything all right?" I swallowed hard. "Yes, I'm sure. It's for health reasons." He didn't press further, perhaps hearing the desperation in my voice. Within minutes, my schedule was changed. Day shifts only, starting next week. As I hung up, relief washed over me. But it was short-lived. Deep down, I knew that daylight wouldn't be enough to keep the shadows at bay. The transition to day shifts wasn't easy. My body clock rebelled, and I found myself jumping at shadows even in broad daylight. I installed a state-of-the-art security system in my apartment, complete with cameras and motion sensors. My colleagues noticed the change in me, the dark circles under my eyes, the constant vigilance, but I brushed off their concerns with vague excuses. Nights were the worst. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, every creak and rustle sending my heart racing. On the rare occasions I did sleep, my dreams were filled with endless fog and pursuing shadows. I began taking different routes to work, varying my routine, always watching over my shoulder. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch a glimpse of a dark figure, only for it to vanish when I turned to look. The logical part of my mind insisted it was all in my head, a result of stress and that one terrifying night. But another part of me, a part one was growing increasingly unable to ignore, whispered that the nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. It's been 3 years since that fog-shrouded night, and its impact still reverberates through every aspect of my life. The rational doctor I once was now coexists with a man who sees threats in every shadow, who can't shake the feeling of being watched. I've sought help, of course. Therapists have suggested everything from PTSD to sleep paralysis to explain my experience. Part of me wants to believe them, to accept a diagnosis that fits neatly into the world I understood before. But none of their explanations can fully account for what I saw, what I felt, what I continue to feel. My career has suffered. I'm competent in my work, but the easy camaraderie I once had with colleagues has been replaced by a wary distance. They sense the change in me, the constant tension, even if they don't understand its source. Some nights, when the fog rolls in thick, I find myself standing at the window, peering into the mist. I'm searching, I realize, both dreading and hoping to catch a glimpse of that hooded figure. Because as terrifying as that encounter was, it's the uncertainty that truly haunts me. Was it real? Am I losing my mind? Or did I glimpse something that night that I was never meant to see? Something that has forever altered my perception of reality. I don't have the answers, but I know one thing for certain. In the fog of that autumn night, I lost the man I used to be. And I fear he's gone forever, swallowed by the mist and the whispers that still echo in my dreams. For as long as I can remember, the forest near my home has been my sanctuary. I found solace among the towering pines and whispering leaves. Even as an adult, working long hours at the local library, I maintained my habit of nightly walks in the woods. It was my way of unwinding, of connecting with nature. But the events of that night 6 months ago changed everything. Even now, as I sit in my cozy living room, the memory sends chills down my spine. It was a crisp autumn evening when I set out for my usual walk. The air was thick with the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. I remembered smiling to myself as I laced up my hiking boots, anticipating the peaceful solitude that awaited me. The forest entrance was just a short distance from my backyard, a well-worn path I'd traversed countless times. As I stepped into the woods, the canopy above filtered the moonlight, casting dappled shadows on the ground. The familiar crunch of leaves under my feet and the distant hoot of an owl were comforting sounds, like old friends welcoming me back. I breathed deeply, feeling the day's stress melt away. This was my time, my escape from the mundane worries of life. I had my usual route planned, a loop that would take me past the old oak, around the small pond, and back home in about an hour. Little did I know that this routine, so ingrained in my life, was about to take a terrifying turn. As I ventured deeper into the forest, something felt off. At first, it was subtle, a slight chill in the air that hadn't been there before, a stillness that seemed unnatural. The usual nighttime sounds of the forest seemed muted, as if the woods were holding their breath. I paused, my senses suddenly on high alert. The trees, once friendly guardians, now loomed ominously. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist in ways I'd never noticed before. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness, making me jump. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the growing unease. But as I resumed walking, the feeling only intensified. The air grew thick, almost oppressive, and I found myself struggling to breathe normally. The familiar path now seemed alien. Had that gnarled tree always been there? Was that rock formation new? Doubt crept into my mind, eroding my confidence in my knowledge of these woods. A mist began to rise from the forest floor, curling around my ankles like ghostly fingers. The moonlight, filtering through the canopy, cast eerie, shifting patterns on the ground. Every shadow seemed to harbor a potential threat. As I pushed forward, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, I couldn't help but wonder, had the forest always been this menacing, or had something fundamental changed on this fateful night? As I pressed on, the feeling of being watched intensified. It was as if 1,000 invisible eyes were tracking my every move. I spun around, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing behind me. But there was only darkness and the swirling mist. A twig snapped to my left, and I whirled toward the sound. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small and frightened in the oppressive silence. No response came, save for the rustling of leaves in a non-existent breeze. I tried to rationalize the situation. "It's just an animal," I told myself. "A deer, maybe, or a fox." But deep down, I knew this was different. The forest had never felt so alive, so menacing. As I resumed walking, quicker now, I heard it, a low, guttural sound that was neither human nor animal. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My heart pounded in my chest, blood rushing in my ears. I broke into a run, no longer caring about my usual path. All I wanted was to get out of the woods. But as I ran, the sounds followed. Branches whipped at my face, roots seemed to reach up to trip me. Was it my panicked imagination, or were the trees actually moving, closing in around me? A shadow darted in my peripheral vision. I turned to look but saw nothing. Yet the feeling persisted. Something was there, just out of sight, always just behind me. "This isn't real," I gasped, even as another inhuman growl echoed through the trees. "This can't be real." But as the forest around me seemed to come alive with malevolent intent, I realized that reality as I knew it had been left far behind. My sense of direction completely abandoned me. Every tree, every rock looked the same, yet different. The path I had walked hundreds of times had vanished, replaced by an endless maze of twisted trunks and grasping branches. I stumbled through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps. How long had I been running? Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to have lost all meaning in this nightmarish version of my once beloved forest. I tried to use the stars to orient myself, but the canopy above had become an impenetrable ceiling of leaves and branches, blocking out all light. The moon, my faithful nighttime companion, was nowhere to be seen. Panic began to set in. I was lost, truly lost, in a place I had thought I knew like the back of my hand. The realization was terrifying. I tried to calm myself, to think logically. The forest isn't that big, I reasoned. If I just keep walking in one direction, I have to reach the edge eventually. But no matter how far I walked, the trees never thinned, the forest never ended. It was as if the woods had expanded infinitely, trapping me in an endless green hell. Exhaustion began to take its toll. My legs ached, my lungs burned. But the fear of stopping, of letting whatever was out there catch up to me, kept me moving forward, always forward, into the unknown heart of the forest that had betrayed me. The feeling of being hunted intensified with every step. Whatever was out there, it was getting closer. I could feel its presence, a malevolent force that seemed to seep from the very trees themselves. A branch snapped behind me, unnaturally loud in the eerie silence. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. Yet the sensation of eyes upon me, of something breathing down my neck, was overwhelming. I ran again, no longer caring about direction or stealth. Branches whipped at my face, roots seemed to reach up to trip me. The forest itself felt alive, hostile, determined to keep me trapped within its grasp. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, rustling leaves, heavy footfalls, that same inhuman growl I'd heard earlier. But every time I looked back, there was nothing there. Just shadows and mist, playing tricks on my terrified mind. "Leave me alone," I screamed into the darkness, my voice cracking with fear. The forest seemed to laugh in response, a sinister whisper carried on the wind. I ran faster, driven by pure adrenaline and the primal urge to survive. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, when my legs were about to give out and my lungs felt like they would burst, I saw it, a glimmer of light through the trees. Hope surged through me, giving me a final burst of energy. I crashed through the underbrush, ignoring the thorns that tore at my clothes and skin. The light grew brighter, and suddenly, I burst out of the tree lean into my own backyard. I collapsed onto the grass, gulping in great lungfuls of air. The night was calm, the stars twinkling peacefully overhead as if nothing had happened. I looked back at the forest, half expecting to see some monstrous shape emerge. But there was nothing, just the familiar line of trees, silent and innocuous. As the adrenaline faded, I was left shaken and confused. What had just happened? Had it all been in my mind? Days passed, and I couldn't shake the memory of that terrifying night. I avoided the forest, jumping at shadows and tree branches tapping on my window. It wasn't until I ran into my friend Tom at the local diner that things took an even stranger turn. "Did you hear about Old Man Jenkins?" Tom asked casually over coffee. I shook my head, still distracted by my own thoughts. "The forest ranger," Tom continued. "He passed away last week. Heart attack, they say. Found him right at the forest's edge." My blood ran cold. The timing couldn't be a coincidence, could it? That revelation changed everything. Suddenly, my experience in the forest took on a new, chilling dimension. Had I encountered something supernatural that night? Was it Old Man Jenkins' spirit, lost and angry, that had pursued me through the woods? The forest, once my sanctuary, now loomed as a constant threat. I found myself unable to look at it without feeling a surge of panic. My nightly walks, once a source of peace, were now a distant memory. I've tried to rationalize what happened, to convince myself it was all in my head. But deep down, I know the truth. Something changed in those woods that night, something beyond my understanding. Even now, months later, I sometimes wake in the night, certain I can hear distant, inhuman growls carried on the wind. And when the mist rolls in, clinging to the trees, I close my curtains tight and try not to remember the night the forest came alive. 5 years have passed since that chilling winter night, but the memory still haunts me. I used to be just an ordinary woman living in a quiet suburban neighborhood, working as a librarian and finding joy in the simple things. My nightly walks with Luna, my loyal Labrador, were the highlight of my day. But one encounter changed everything, leaving me questioning reality and forever altering my perception of the darkness that lurks in the shadows of our seemingly peaceful world. The clock on my nightstand read 2:45 a.m. when I woke up, right on schedule. I'd always been a night owl, finding solace in the quiet hours when the rest of the world slept. Luna, sensing it was time for our walk, was already waiting by the door, her tail wagging in anticipation. I pulled on my thick winter coat and grabbed Luna's leash. The moment we stepped outside, the crisp night air nipped at my cheeks. Our neighborhood, usually bustling during the day, was transformed into a silent, almost ethereal landscape under the soft glow of streetlights. Luna and I had our route down to a science. We'd start down Maple Street, cut through the small park, and loop back around Elm Avenue. The rhythmic sound of Luna's paws on the pavement and the jingle of her collar were the only sounds breaking the night's silence. These walks were my sanctuary. In the stillness of the night, with Luna by my side, I felt at peace. The worries of the day would melt away, replaced by a sense of calm and clarity. Little did I know that this night would be different, that the safety I felt in these familiar streets was about to be shattered. We were halfway through our usual route, just entering the park, when I saw him. Under the flickering light of an old lamppost stood a figure that seemed out of place in the quiet night. It was a man, tall and unnaturally still, wearing what looked like a vintage suit. But it was his face, or rather, what covered it, that made my blood run cold. He wore a clown mask, its once bright colors now faded and grimy. The painted smile, stretched wide in an eternal grin, seemed to mock the very concept of joy. In the dim light, the mask's empty eye sockets appeared to be bottomless pits of darkness. Luna's low growl snapped me out of my initial shock. Her hackles were raised, and she stared intently at the figure, clearly as unsettled as I was. I tugged gently on her leash, urging her to keep moving. "It's probably just someone coming back from a costume party," I whispered, more to convince myself than Luna. As we passed by, I could feel the weight of the masked figure's gaze upon us. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to maintain a steady pace. The crunch of gravel under my feet seemed deafeningly loud in the silence. Once we were past him, I chanced a quick glance back. The figure hadn't moved, but his head had turned, following our movement. A shiver ran down my spine, and I quickened our pace, eager to put distance between us and the unsettling stranger. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a night that would change everything. We had just exited the park when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind us. My heart rate quickened as I realized they were matching our pace, neither falling behind nor catching up. Luna's ears perked up, and she looked back, a low whine escaping her throat. I tried to rationalize the situation. "It's just another late-night walker," I told myself. But the memory of that eerie clown mask kept intruding, sending chills down my spine. I picked up our pace slightly, and to my horror, so did the footsteps behind us. Gathering my courage, I glanced over my shoulder. There he was, the masked figure, about 50 feet behind us. His gait was odd, almost mechanical, yet purposeful. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows as he moved, making it seem like the darkness itself was reaching out for us. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this some kind of sick joke? A prankster taking things too far? Or was it something more sinister? The rational part of my brain fought against the rising tide of panic, but with each passing moment, logic was losing the battle. Luna, sensing my distress, began to pull on the leash, urging us to move faster. Her usual calm demeanor had been replaced by a nervous energy that only fueled my own fear. I could feel my palms growing sweaty despite the cold, my grip on the leash tightening. We turned onto Elm Avenue, usually a comforting sight as it led straight to our home. But tonight, the familiar street seemed endless, the shadows between the streetlights darker and more menacing than ever before. The footsteps behind us never faltered, never slowed. I knew I had a choice to make. We could keep this nerve-wracking pace, hoping to make it home before our pursuer caught up, or we could run and risk provoking a chase. As the footsteps drew ever closer, the decision was made for me. Adrenaline surged through my veins as I broke into a run, Luna matching my pace perfectly. The sudden burst of speed caught our pursuer off guard, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope we might escape. But that hope was short-lived. The footsteps behind us quickened, transforming into a rhythmic pounding that seemed to shake the very ground. I didn't dare look back, focusing instead on the path ahead, desperately searching for a safe haven. The world became a blur of shadows and muted colors as we raced down Elm Avenue. My lungs burned with each gasping breath, the cold air searing my throat. Luna ran beside me, her previous whines now replaced by determined pants. In my panic, I made a critical mistake. Instead of heading straight home, I turned down a side street, hoping to lose our pursuer in the maze of residential roads. But as we rounded the corner, I realized my error. This street was darker, the houses set further back from the road, offering more shadows for danger to lurk in. The sound of pursuit never wavered. If anything, it seemed to be getting closer. The rhythmic pounding was now accompanied by something else, a low, guttural sound that was neither laugh nor growl, but somehow both. It was a sound that spoke of malice, of hunger, of otherworldly intent. My mind raced as fast as my feet. How could anyone maintain this pace? It wasn't human. The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through me. If not human, then what? As we approached the end of the street, I saw our salvation, the warm, welcoming lights of our home. With a final burst of speed, Luna and I sprinted toward safety, the malevolent presence hot on our heels. We burst through the front door, my trembling hands fumbling with the keys to lock it behind us. The sound of my racing heartbeat nearly drowned out the click of the deadbolt sliding into place. Luna whimpered softly, pressing herself against my legs as I moved through the house, frantically checking and securing every window and door. Once everything was locked, I collapsed onto the living room floor, my back against the wall, facing the front door. Luna curled up beside me, her warm body offering little comfort against the chill of fear that had settled deep in my bones. For what felt like hours, I sat there, straining my ears for any sound of our pursuer. The silence was oppressive, broken only by my ragged breathing and Luna's occasional whine. Every creak of the house settling made me flinch. Every shadow cast by passing car headlights sent my heart racing anew. Eventually, I gathered the courage to approach the window. Peering through a small gap in the curtains, I scanned the street outside. It was empty, no sign of the masked figure. Had it all been in my imagination? But the burning in my lungs and the trembling of my limbs told a different story. As the first light of dawn began to creep across the sky, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. But the fear lingered, a constant presence in the back of my mind. Something told me this night was far from over. Sunlight streamed through the windows, a stark contrast to the terrors of the night. I hadn't slept a wink, my body still humming with residual adrenaline. Luna hadn't left my side, her usual playful demeanor replaced by a watchful alertness that mirrored my own state. As I moved through my morning routine on autopilot, my mind kept replaying the events of the night. The mask, the chase, the inhuman endurance of our pursuer. It all seemed like a bad dream in the light of day. But the lingering fear and Luna's uncharacteristic behavior were stark reminders of its reality. I called in sick to work, unable to face the outside world just yet. Every time I glanced out the window, I half expected to see that grotesque clown mask staring back at me. The rational part of my brain tried to make sense of what had happened. Maybe it was just a sick prank, a thrill-seeker getting their kicks by scaring unsuspecting night walkers. But deep down, I knew it was something more. There was a malevolence in that pursuit that defied logical explanation. As I sat at my kitchen table, clutching a cup of cold coffee, a nagging thought began to form. I needed answers, and I knew just where to start looking. With shaking hands, I opened my laptop and began searching. At first, I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Local news reports of similar incidents, perhaps? But as I scrolled through page after page, a headline from an article dated 50 years ago caught my eye. Masked killer terrorizes town. My blood ran cold as I read on. The article described a series of brutal murders that had occurred in our town half a century ago. The killer, never caught, was known for wearing a vintage clown mask during his attacks. The description of the mask matched exactly what I had seen the night before. Faded colors, an exaggerated grin, empty eye sockets that seemed to swallow light. I dug deeper, finding old police reports and witness statements. The details were chilling. Victims reported being stalked by a figure in a clown mask before their attacks. Some who escaped described an inhuman persistence in the pursuit, a relentless chase that defied normal human endurance. The final attack had occurred in the very park Luna and I had walked through last night. After that, the killings had stopped abruptly, the masked murderer vanishing without a trace. Some speculated he had died or moved on, while others whispered of darker, supernatural explanations. As I stared at a grainy black and white photo of the mask, identical to the one I'd seen, a horrifying realization dawned on me. What if the terror of 50 years ago had somehow returned? The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. I abandoned our nightly walks, much to Luna's dismay. Every sound outside my window, every shadow in the corner of my eye, sent my heart racing. I installed a sophisticated security system, added extra locks to my doors, and kept the curtains drawn at all times. My colleagues at the library noticed the change in me, the dark circles under my eyes, the way I flinched at sudden movements. But how could I explain what had happened? Who would believe me? Luna, too, seemed changed. Her playful spirit diminished, replaced by a watchful wariness that mirrored my own. 5 years have passed since that haunting night, yet its impact lingers like a shadow over my life. I've never again ventured out after dark, and Luna, now older and grayer, seems content with our daytime walks in the busy park. The rational part of my mind still struggles to make sense of what happened. Was it truly the ghost or reincarnation of a long-dead killer? Or perhaps a copycat, someone twisted enough to emulate those decades-old crimes? Sometimes, in my weakest moments, I wonder if it was all a vivid hallucination, a product of an overworked mind. But then I remember the sound of those relentless footsteps, the inhuman endurance of our pursuer, and the bone-chilling gaze from behind that mask. And I know, deep in my soul, that what I experienced was real and beyond ordinary explanation. Even now, on quiet nights when the wind whistles through the trees, I sometimes think I hear distant footsteps. In the split second before I draw the curtains, I brace myself, half expecting to see that grotesque clown mask peering in at me. The experience has taught me that the boundary between our safe, ordinary world and the realm of inexplicable horrors is far thinner than we'd like to believe. And sometimes, in the dark of night, that boundary can disappear entirely. To hear more stories like this, subscribe and leave a like.